Howdy, everybody. Turns out I couldn't be there this morning, so I'm going to record our lecture in the most least satisfying way ever to do a class. I'm doing it by video. A couple warnings. I have a mechanical keyboard, so it's a little clicky clacky, and I had to go back a couple of slides from what first period had seen to help out second period because I did not get as far. A little distracted, but I replaced some of the pictures because I found better ones. So if you are following along with your guided notes, we're picking up with the competition part of the notes, and we'll work through to the end of the notes here. So in class, I talked about different things you could have done during. Oops, I went too far. During Shakespeare's time, if you were bored, seeking entertainment, and we talked about how you might use TikTok, Netflix, video games, reading a book maybe. They couldn't there wasn't a lot of people that would read books during Shakespeare's time because a lot of folks were illiterate. You guys are lucky. People your age, not growing up in the house of a noble, you probably wouldn't have been very literate. So, hey, yay for the future. Anyway, a few things that you could have done instead. Bear baiting. That's a drawing of a bear baiting. Essentially, they would stake a bear in the middle of a ring and stick dogs and sticks at the bear. The bear would eventually die instead of many of the dogs. I imagine the people probably didn't turn out completely unharmed, but the whole point was to eventually kill the bear, and the people would, take bets. Gambling was one of the things they would do too. So this would be something they could gamble on, and it was a form of entertainment for them. Clearly, PETA wasn't around yet, or common sense. Just be kind to animals. Races, foot races, horse races, that sort of thing you could see. Gambling, a lot of dice tossing in alleyways and in pubs, things like that. Music, I compared it to maybe if you've played the Elder Scrolls, like Skyrim or something, going to an inn and hearing a bard sing and play a lyre. You could kind of get some karaoke going too, with people singing the songs they all knew. There would definitely would have been songs folks knew. In fact, the main way people knew stories was through things like a bard or some other oral form of passing along storytelling. Um, Drinking and socializing, of course, could be combined with many of these other things. Prostitution and public executions, which, of all the choices of things to take your kid to, none of these are great. None of them. Maybe music. There you go. That's the only good one. Public executions would most often happen at 8 o'clock in the morning. The whole idea of the bell tolling, for whom the bell tolls for thee, that whole thing, would be because at 8 a.m. when the bell tolls, a criminal would be executed. And I think I'll be able to pull up a picture of a chopping block. Actually, let me grab that really quickly for you. 1 second. All right, here is a chopping block. This one, I took this picture when I was in the armory at the Tower of London. You can go there; it's a museum now. This is what they would have used for those public executions they held on Saturday mornings. This one specifically was actually used, and it's kind of a gross color from its use. The last recorded use of this chopping block and axe was in 1747 when they executed a Scottish baron um, who fought against battles. It's a long story that I'm not super familiar with, and it's not that relevant to our point. But this is a form of entertainment folks could have pursued during Shakespeare's lifetime. Of course, that axe was used after Shakespeare died, but it still applies. So these are the alternatives for entertainment. So instead of going to see these things, many folks would opt to go see a play. Shakespeare wasn't the only name in town. There were other plays around, other theaters to compete with. So maybe you'll have a little better idea of why something like Romeo and Juliet, which isn't his best play, many folks would find to be quite enjoyable at that time because it's better than watching some dudes beat up a bear or somebody get their head chopped off on a Saturday morning. Um, Conditions in London, they weren't great at the time. The river was polluted with raw sewage. They didn't have any kind of plumbing and running water like we would have. And the trees used for fuel and wood burning was the main source of cook fires, of heating your home or your inn. You would burn logs, and the smoke would be all over the place. If you've ever been to a campfire or had a fire in your backyard, a little bonfire or something, you know how it smells of that smoke in your hair, stuck in your clothes, and things like that. That was kind of all the time. But I guess that smoke smell would be better than other things. And of course, the people, lots of folks were not very rich. This is a picture that I did update too, since I showed it to first period. It's another sketch, another drawing, but it's representative of more or less what England, London would have looked like. London specifically would have looked like during Shakespeare's time. You can see this bridge here. They would have. I don't know if this is the London Bridge or not, but the London Bridge today is basically just a bridge. But at one time, the London Bridge and other bridges like it would have held shops and houses and things like that on top of the bridge, which is wild. Um, Personal hygiene also not great. Bathing was considered dangerous, partly because they had this weird view of the humors, which they thought were things that controlled our health. Anything wet was mostly bad. They were on sort of the right track. Their water certainly wasn't great. Lots of bacteria and things like that. Body odor would have been very, very strong. People not bathing very often because they were afraid of baths. Also, not washing their clothes very often. And if you're heating up your water to take a warm bath, you'd have to, boil a big kettle and then dump the water into a tub or something. So it wouldn't be as easy as we have it turning on a faucet. Childhood diseases were one of the reasons I talked yesterday about the life expectancy being quite low during this time, because so many children tragically died before they even reached the age of 5 years old. Sadly, a bit like Shakespeare's son Hamnet. Smallpox was one of the issues. There were no vaccines yet. We're living in a pretty great time, guys. Lots of things our science and medicine has done to help us be rid of things like smallpox and the bubonic plague, the Black Death. Maybe you've heard of before. It would flare up from time to time. The main sweeping plague that took over much of Europe happened just before Shakespeare's time, the end of the medieval period, and it's kind of partly responsible for the advancements and relative better life that people found during the Renaissance. Um, Not because everybody died, but because in fighting the plague, people found better ways to take care of themselves, that sort of thing. I also replaced this picture of a chamber pot because that's a better one. That's a chamber pot, folks. So they didn't have running water, you didn't have indoor plumbing. So if you woke up in the night and needed to use the potty, you would pull out a little pot, literally a pot, and take care of business. And then in the morning, you would dump it out your window. And those were the open sewers. So everything in the roads would just run down to that river, and then you'd get water from that river for bathing and cooking and all sorts of fun things. Of course, everything was quite crowded in the city as well. All right, I should stay back. I forgot you guys are taking notes. If you're watching this video in class and somebody's showing it to you, feel free to ask for it to pause, but you can also, of course, pause it yourself. All right. Clothing. Most folks, especially, the majority of folks living in poverty, would have one set of clothing they would use all year long, and they would rarely wash it. For first period, this is sort of where we left off. Um, and their underclothing, their underwear, they would sleep in it, and they would change it very infrequently. Also, not bathing much, so issues here. Bad smells. Along with the thing I mentioned earlier, people would have these things called nosegays, which was essentially like a potpourri necklace they would wear and use that to help mask the smell of everybody else. Although if everybody stinks, I guess you maybe stop noticing it after a while. I don't know. And clothing would be handed down from the rich to the poor. So if you're poor and you're getting these rich people clothes, you're getting something that somebody wore a ton and didn't bathe very often while wearing. So it's in bad shape. They actually, in many parts of the world, where you saw classes separated like this, like they had here, there were laws called sumptuary laws, where literally the poor weren't allowed to wear the clothing, some types of clothing that the rich were allowed to wear. Things like silk were barred from poor folks wearing. They could be thrown in jail, literally, for wearing fancy clothes. How dare they rise above their station? Okay, theater in London. Here we go. This is play stuff. So this image here is a cutaway of the Globe Theater, and you can see the top roof section here is open to the elements, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So before the existence of something like the Globe Theater, theater was performed in the courtyards of inns. So that's what Shakespeare would have seen, a traveling group coming through his hometown. The acting companies would travel from city to city and, show their plays, make some money. And if they were something like they had a patron, like Lord Chamberlain's men, they would make sure that they broadcast that so everybody knew how fancy their lord was, their noble. The first public theater was built in 1576. This is before Shakespeare's time. He would have been 12 years old, I think, at that point. I'm bad at math. So he maybe would have seen a play. I don't know if he ever traveled to London, maybe, but he most likely would have seen them in the courtyards traveling through his town. The theaters, though, would be daytime only performances, open air, and that's largely because of lighting. They didn't have electric light back then. But I think the open air element probably helped too with the smell of so many people crammed together. They didn't have a lot of set design. I'll show you some pictures of the Globe Theater in a moment. Instead, they would pretend things like these big posts. In one scene, it might be the pillar inside of a palace, and in the next scene, they'll just describe it as a tree. And that is partly why you'll hear such um, such long descriptive passages when the actors are describing where they are. They're doing that for the sake of the audience, because the audience, otherwise would just see the same stage they saw in another scene that was supposed to be a palace, and now it's a forest. So instead, they would rely on things like the music. They would have music, sound. In fact, the Globe Theater is kind of infamous for, up in one of these windows, they had a cannon. They would fire that cannon off during war scenes. And I'll talk more about this later, but it did burn down the Globe Theater at one point. Um, Costumes. I'll show you some costumes too in a bit. Some props, limited props, but ultimately the main thing that brought the magic was the great description. This is a picture of the Globe Theater as it stood in 2007 when I was there. It looks pretty much the same now too. Again, this theater was built in the 90s. It's not the original Globe. It's just modeled after the original. So generally, theater was for everyone, not just for the wealthy. Groundlings were the poorer people who could come, and their tickets didn't cost very much, but they were allowed to stand in the front during the performance. These performances would last a long time. Imagine, you read Romeo and Juliet probably over the course of a few weeks. We'll do the same for Macbeth. These plays would last hours, maybe about 3.5 hours. They were performed pretty quickly. They weren't stopping to talk about each scene and get people's opinions. And they were performed by experts, so it did roll a little more smoothly than what we'll see. Um, but also part of this they would have had an intermission where people could stop and go out and, I don't know, get a ham, munch on a ham while they're watching their show. But the poorer people would be standing shoulder to shoulder, and I showed you earlier how high that stage looks. And I have a picture again. I'll pull that up in a moment. So it was crowded. It wasn't a great view of the stage. Women weren't allowed to perform. They had some pretty strict views of what men and women were allowed to do. There it is. That's the stage. So again, if you were standing here and you were someone shorter, it would have been difficult to see if anybody very tall was around. Of course, England at this time didn't have a lot of tall weirdos like myself. So the Globe Theater was built by Shakespeare's company in 1598. So at this point, Shakespeare's been in England for probably a decade and a half, maybe 15, going on 15 years. And he had worked in other theaters. There was one called the Rose Theater that he was responsible for too. But Shakespeare's company, now he's in charge. They build this theater, so it's one of his investments, and he had a few partners too. So it wasn't just him. It was 3 stories high. Still, the one today is too, and it could seat 3,000 people. So a lot of people packed in there. That theater burned down 15 years later from that cannon shot during a performance. It caught the roof on fire, and these people, they would build the roofs out of thatch. My voice cracked. They'd build them out of thatch. So basically, it's just kindling. The whole roof is kindling, and they lit a cannon, and a spark flew off, hit the kindling, and of course, the thing burned down. So it burned down in 1613. They did rebuild, and they reopened it. And when they reopened it, they very smartly built the new roof out of slate, so it had like a stone tile. Later, it did get closed. Or operated on for a long time past Shakespeare's death. He died in 1616, so he was only alive for 3 years after the rebuilt theater. Um, the new theater operated until 1642, when the Puritans, who were strongly against theater acting for religious reasons, closed it down. And then it stood vacant for a few decades before it finally burned down during the Great Fire in London. Actors. So this camera is on the stage looking out. This is a scene. I think this is actually Romeo and Juliet. This looks like the masquerade, the ball there. So down here you can see what would be groundlings. Of course, these are just tourists, modern people going to see a play. And then the people up here in these balconies, this is the second story, the third story, they're paying a bit extra for these seats. So all men performed the roles back then. There's a lady here. So today, we let women act. So all men performed the roles then. Female parts were played by young boys. Usually, these boys playing the female roles hadn't quite hit puberty yet, so their voices maybe were pitched a bit higher. There wasn't a lot of 5 o'clock shadow showing on their faces. I don't think I would have done very well as a female role, unfortunately. I've got this deep man voice and my big beard, of course. Sorry about that. They wouldn't have had any hugging or kissing on stage. Of course, there was romance in these plays, but they would have done something more like a stage hug, a stage kiss. Um, yeah, very prudish, especially with the Puritans around. So, the Globe. Many playwrights didn't have anywhere to do their plays before they built theaters. When they built the Globe Theater, they turned a barn into the theater. So they took parts from a barn and moved it across the river and built a theater. Puritans burnt the theater down. Boo, evil. Globe was built. Oh, so that was before the Globe. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So this was a Rose Theater, I believe. So the Rose Theater was built from a barn that was turned into a theater. The Puritans burned that down because sin. And there's actually, if you go to Shakespeare's birthplace museum, they have a ring there that you can buy. It's a reproduction of a ring, but it was found in the ruined ash of the Rose Theater. It's kind of neat. So anyway, after the Puritans burned that theater down, that's when Shakespeare and his group built the Globe Theater. And then it burned down from that cannon fire in 1613. Rebuilt it, yay. Then it burned down during the Great London Fire, the Fire of London. And then this was rebuilt in the 90s, the current Globe Theater. So here is a view of the current theater. This is one of the pictures I took when I was sitting in I think the first story seats. Up here, you can see this window. This may have been a similar window that they used to shoot that cannon fire when it caught the roof on fire. And you can kind of look, if you see closely here, they have sort of a imitation thatch roof now. They try to make it look as close as possible to the original, but they're not going to use thatch roof because that would be against fire codes. You can also see these pillars. They look like they're very fancy and made of marble, but they're actually wooden. And they're painted to look like fancy marble. We've got that here too. This is probably the balcony where Juliet would have stood during her famous line, "Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?" Up here, you can see the painting of the heavens, and I have another picture of that in a moment. There it is. I showed this in class to a few of you too. So when the actors talk about the heavens, or they talk about it being daytime, maybe they'd point to the sun, or nighttime, they'd point to the moon. Then you have I believe these are the zodiac signs across around the center, the middle. Very slightly, you can see here that the rise in the stage in the bottom right here, where the trap door is showing. And this would be the center stage of this door. And then there's a stage right and stage left doors as well for actors to enter. There's that trap door again. I showed this picture in class. I'm sitting about from this section. It's like the third box over on the opposite side here. The more money you had, the closer to the stage you sat, and partly that's because it's a better view, but also it's because this wraps around. It's a circular structure. People could see you. So if you're fancy and you have tons of money, you want everybody to see that you're at this play because Shakespeare's a hot ticket. So you're going to sit in a visible place. Not a great view of the stage necessarily because you're seeing what they're presenting to the front of the audience. You're seeing from the back a bit, but you're close, very close, and you don't have to smell all those people that you'd be standing around otherwise. Also, I should point out too, this is a concrete floor now, but during his time, it would have been probably just hard packed dirt covered in some straw or something. So if it rains, it got quite muddy, and it rains a lot there. It was raining when I was there. I went in March. That's not active play season, so we didn't get to actually see a play here because of the weather. If you want to see a play at the Globe Theater in London, you got to go during the warmer months, summer months, late spring. All right. So now we're going to talk a little history. The history kind of leading up to Queen Elizabeth and King Henry VIII is super interesting. I'm not a huge history guy, and if any of you are interested, I can direct you to some links, but um, I'm always eager to learn more about this. So this is Queen Elizabeth. As you can see the date, she ruled from 1558 to 1603. That is most of Shakespeare's life. He was born just before she came into power, and he wouldn't have known any different because he would have been a little baby. And then she died when he was an adult. 12 years, 13 years away from his death, so he would have been in his late 30s. Queen Elizabeth, was considered the bastard daughter of King Henry VIII and one of his wives, Anne Boleyn. Um, she's considered a bastard daughter because Anne Boleyn gave birth before he married her. He was married still to his first wife. So Henry VIII is famous for a lot of reasons, infamous for a lot of reasons. One of them is for his six wives. Um, there's a new musical out. It came out in the fall. It's about King Henry VIII's wives. I think it's called The Six or something, and it's like a pop thing. It's silly. I'll probably watch it anyway. King Henry VIII had Anne, Queen Elizabeth's mommy, beheaded for treason. It's complicated. His history is very complicated, but essentially, King Henry was trying to have a male heir to the throne. He wanted to have a legitimate son that could rule. He had some sons, but they weren't always legitimate, and they didn't live very long. So he eventually had Anne Boleyn's head chopped off. His first wife he didn't execute. He just divorced her and changed the religion of the country to make that happen. Um, Queen Elizabeth is the younger sister of Queen Mary, Queen of Scots. Maybe you've heard of her before. She's the original Bloody Mary, not the one that you say the name in the mirror or whatever. This Mary is bloody because of her uh, religious wars, against Protestants and Catholic Scotland. Eventually, Bloody Mary was the Queen of England for a bit. I think it was just about 2 years before Queen Elizabeth took over. Queen Elizabeth was said to be a virgin queen because she never married. She very smartly, very politically would play male suitors against one another for the betterment of her plans, her causes. There are a lot of stories about maybe she wasn't so virginal. She had men that she would meet with quite often, but I don't know about any of that. Um, Boy, this painting really features this corset, how tightly her stomach would have been crunched together, almost like a boa constrictor or something. That's wild. Um, she did never marry, but she was a huge supporter of theater. She believed in it. She liked Shakespeare. She's said to have gone to some of Shakespeare's plays. So you could be a poor person, go to his play, and see the Queen. That's wild. Um, yeah, okay. So here are her loving parents. There's King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. I will send you guys a link, make this available for you to check out. This isn't an assignment, but you may be interested if you think the story sounds wild. Here are his six wives with a little brief, interesting fact about them. You can click on any one of these, and it'll take you to like a whole book of information about the different wives. Let me go back to my original thing here. So his first wife was Catherine of Aragon. He divorced her. He did have a daughter with her, Mary the First. That's and then he married Anne Boleyn. Um, the Catherine of Aragon story, she was originally married to King Henry VIII's brother, who was meant to be the King of England. They got married and very quickly fell ill. Both of them were sick. She lived. King Henry's brother, Arthur, did not. He died. So then at that point, she was old enough to be the queen, but she couldn't be the queen. So she had to wait until Henry was of age. So she married King Henry when he was 18 and she was 23. Um, and they were married for a while before he divorced her and changed the religion of England. And then he married Anne Boleyn. They were not married that long, 3 years, and he had her executed. They had Elizabeth. Elizabeth went on to later rule for a very long period of time. Later, he married Jane Seymour. It said that they were quite in love, King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. She is quite a bit younger than him, born in 1508, while he was, I forget what year he was born in. Uh, 1490 something. But anyway, they were married for a year. She got pregnant, had a son, Henry the Seventh or Sixth, sorry. Uh, but she did not do so well from childbirth and died from complications of childbirth. So Henry VI went on to live for a bit, and he did rule for 6 years. But during that 6 year period, he was 10 when he started ruling, and he died when he was 16. Sickly boy, was not very healthy. So anyway, after Jane Seymour, he married Anne of Cleves. Now, Anne was very young. Um, she was, 15. So when they got married in 1540. So she was 25. At that point, though, he is in his 50s. Um, they were only married for a bit, and he never thought she was very pretty, apparently, thought she was ugly, and wanted to get that marriage annulled. They never consummated. Later, he married Catherine Howard, who was even younger. She was 15 or 16 years old when he married her, and he was in his 50s. They were married for 2 years, and he had her executed. So the second of his wives that he had the head chopped off. He had her executed because he felt lied to and betrayed when he found out that she was not a virgin, and she had somebody else while she was married to the King of England. She was with another guy, so he killed her. And then he was married to Catherine Parr, and at the end of his life, mostly she probably was more of a nursemaid. She was there to take care of him in his old age before he passed. Again, cool website. Okay, so those are his wives, Henry VIII's wives. Anyway, moving on. There's Henry VIII in all his glory. This picture always I just laugh at. He was not a very tall man, and he seemed to have a lot of like a chip on his shoulder. That he was trying to prove how manly he was. Um, this picture here, I just I'm blown away by it. He's holding a sword in one hand and his dagger in the other hand, and he's framing his middle section here where he's got a cod piece sticking out. This is basically like a decorative external cup. So you wear this and it's all jeweled and whatnot, and he's framing it like, look how tough I am. Anyway, he ruled during England's Renaissance. England's Renaissance lasted from 1500 before his reign all the way up through 1650. Well, I guess that was during his reign. 1650, that's well past his reign. It was a period of rebirth of interest in arts and culture and science. There was a discovery of the New World during this time, or right before it kind of kicked it off. That's when Christopher Columbus sailed and found a land that people already lived in, that sort of thing. It's also during this period when Copernicus tries to claim that the sun may in fact be the center of the universe instead of the Earth. So this is an advancement of science. Everybody believed we were the center of everything, and Copernicus was like, hold up, what if the sun is and we're orbiting around that? It was a big deal when he proposed that. So King Henry VIII was considered a Renaissance man. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. It was supposed to be the ideal man, and that's mostly because of his interest. He was an advocate for a lot of these things, the arts, culture, and science. So he thought of himself as a great hunter, a great artist, a great king, all sorts of things he thought of himself as. He's also responsible during this time was when the Reformation of the Catholic Church happened. He wasn't responsible for that, but he did move England into a Protestant country, and it flipped back and forth a bit afterwards. Okay, so during this time, the Renaissance, King Henry to Queen Elizabeth to Queen Elizabeth's cousin, King James, Shakespeare has his career. He starts off as the Lord Chamberlain's man we talked about in class. Later on, he's a part of the King's Men, so that's the king after Queen Elizabeth passes, King James. As a playwright, he's responsible for 38 plays. As a poet, he wrote 154 sonnets. There's those numbers for your slideshow. And that will be it for my video for today. I know this one is a bit long. I have more slides that we'll go over once we come back from break that get into details about the actual play Macbeth. Sorry I couldn't be there this morning, guys. Hope this was okay for you. Have a great break, and I will see you all next year. Bye now. Nope, bye now.